Okay, so elderhood. Who's heard the term elderhood? It's somewhat of a stacked audience, probably, but I didn't make up the term, but we don't hear it as often as we should. Who's really familiar with the term childhood? Adulthood? Right, so you can't have programs, policies, or anything else for a period of life that we don't even have a language for, right? How do you write that into policies or laws or, communities? Really hard. So that's one of the reasons I called my book Elderhood, but we won't dwell on that. Okay, second question. What age is old? Now you'll see I start at 30. There was an article last spring in the New York Times which talked about a relaxation retreat for older Silicon Valley workers over age 30, right? So age might depend on context. On the other hand, in medicine, we talk a lot about the right language for old people is the term older adults. And actually, in our publications, we're only allowed to use the words older adults. And I would argue that that's actually ageist. Because at some point, we're not just older. I mean, a 7-year-old is older than a 5-year-old. A 55-year-old is older than a 45-year-old. And at some point, we are straight up old. Right? So it's a way of softening something that's a blow. And rather than soften it linguistically, I'd rather have it not be a blow. They also like the term adult because we're ageist, right? Because being an adult is good and being an elder is bad. Okay, but back to the question. I'm gonna throw out some numbers and let's have you vote. Age 50 is old. Nobody would have the courage to raise their hand, even if they thought that. Age 60. 65. All right, I'm starting to get some takers. 70. 75. Above 80. Okay, so the higher I get, the more people are part of this. Okay, so the Pew Trust did a survey, and what they found was that how old you think old is depends on how old you are, right? So the younger you are, the younger you think old is. And the older you are, the older you think old is. But interestingly, almost everybody thinks it happens sometime between the ages of 60 and 75, which was essentially what happened in this room too. And in writing the book, I looked at aging throughout time and across cultures, and pretty consistently it has been considered to begin sometime between the ages of 60 and 70. There was this interesting thing that I can't help but throw in, which was, how old do men and women think is old for men and women? And so everybody agrees that men are old at 70. But for women, men think they're old at 68, and women think they're old at 75. So make of that what you will. Different topic. There's also a guy at Stanford, an economist called John Chauvin, who talks about is old age getting older? Now, he defines old age not in terms of some of the usual social and biological metrics, but really in reference to death. That your chance of being, whether or not you are old has to do with your chance of dying. Now, he did this almost a decade ago, and as we know, our when people are dying has diverged even more according to socioeconomic status and racial and ethnic groups since then. But he would argue that for some people, anyway, old may begin later than for others, and we know this to be true. There's a phenomenon of accelerated aging for people who have significant social stressors throughout their lives. Okay, redefining aging. I opened my book with a story about Guy Miko, who is a doctor and professor at Berkeley, and he's just retired. But before he retired, he used to do an exercise with his medical students. He would write up on the board a word, and then he'd say, "Respond. Just write down the words that come to your mind in the next minute." So the first word he would write was old, and so they'd write words. And then the second word he would write would be elder, and they'd write down words. And then he'd ask them to read the words that they had written. And for old, people pretty consistently wrote gray, sad, wrinkled, sick, slow, all those things. And for elder, they wrote wise, respect, powerful, beloved, things like that. Now, the interesting part here, and this really has to do with ageism, is that if you look up the definitions of these two words, now old can pertain to anything, not just people, but if you look up the definition of old as it pertains to a human being, and elder, the definitions are identical. So what we bring to those words has to do with society and culture and our own ageism and notions and ambivalence about aging. So that's good and bad. It's good because if we bring that to it, we can also take it away, we can transform it. But it has an impact on society, right? So there is a part of aging where we say, eat your kale and blueberries, and you can age like these two. So I don't know whose abs look like that. I know mine don't. And I couldn't do that kind of splits as a child, so I'm not going to try it now because I would require orthopedic surgery, I'm sure. But the other thing we hear about is the silver tsunami, right? So there is nothing good about a tsunami, exactly nothing good. And are we saying that the fact that people are living longer brings nothing to society? People are saying that. But if you actually look at it, they're complaining about the new reality. So when I was a kid, we learned about demographics as a pyramid, right? Lots of young people, and then as you move through adulthood into elderhood, fewer and fewer people. Now what's happened, and this isn't just about the baby boomers, this is about the new normal, is that it's basically a rectangle with about the same numbers of people from youth through relatively old age, through the 70s anyway. So that's the new normal, and people say this is a disaster, which is essentially saying we'd like to go back to the pyramid. Now the pyramid looked like this, and it looked like this for a reason. Because a lot of people died in childhood and early adulthood, right? That's why you had this slope of fewer and fewer people. People had extra kids because you expected a bunch of your kids to die. Is that what we want to go back to? Is that something to aim for? It makes no sense. And yet, when we hear this silver tsunami language, we're hearing one part of a more complicated story. And so this sort of bimodal thing of do the right things and you don't have to grow old, not true. Tsunami, also not true. Every population brings different challenges and different opportunities, and we need to get the conversation more in the realm of opportunity and not focus just in a pessimistic, sort of self-defeating way about the negative things, the challenges. Every challenge is an opportunity. So there is also this data. This is called the U-shaped curve of happiness. It has been found worldwide except in the most impoverished countries. Now, is it true that the poorest people in even the wealthier countries probably don't experience this? Yes. And is it true that people who are really miserable might not answer a survey questions? Yes. Now, does that mean that this isn't true for a majority of people? No. It probably is. So what it shows here is this is happiness, and your happiness is pretty good in childhood, and then actually the time of greatest misery is adulthood. So the older people in the room are headed for good news, and your happiness goes up, and you'll see it actually stays up through old age, despite health issues. Similarly, anxiety is highest in adulthood, and then falls as people become elders. And life satisfaction dips, particularly in the middle of middle age, and then goes back up. Now this is interesting. People are like, this just can't be true, and yet they find it repeatedly and repeatedly. Something similar happened this summer, which I think gives us some answers to what's going on here. So this was an article written by Judy Graham, who writes terrific aging health news for Kaiser Health News, so you can just have this delivered into your inbox. So she wrote an article called Why So Many Older Americans Rate Their Health as Good or Even Excellent. And she tweeted within a few hours that all the first comments on her Facebook page were denial, this can't be true. So literally when you provide people with facts, and this was drawn from multiple studies of people, of tens of thousands of Americans. So fact-based, people literally cannot hear fact-based information about aging. I have a colleague in the tech sector who is working on an aging project and says that they take this exact same approach to all their projects, and it starts with data. And so she provides data before they do these meetings about the aging project, and people literally can't engage with it. They go straight to anecdote, whereas in every other sector of this big company you've ever heard of, people will deal with data. So the prejudice is serious and profound. But there is data that people rate their health. Now, is their health at 80 the same as it was at 50 or 30? It's not. But what they're acknowledging is that different phases of life have different realities. And given that reality, things are not that bad. They're good, very good, or excellent. And it's partly that ability to adapt, to change, to see yourself in new ways, which helps people thrive in old age, regardless of their functional abilities. So John Berger was a British sort of philosopher media guy, and he had a television show in the 70s that some people may remember called Ways of Seeing, and it then became a book. So one of the stories he tells in that book is about this painting by Van Gogh, which actually shows up really badly here. But when you see it in life, it's got these vibrant colors, the yellows, the blues. You know, you see the field, you see the birds going, and you think like, wow, that's gorgeous, it's bucolic, etc. And that's one way of looking at it. And then he tells you Van Gogh killed himself the next week. And then you look again and you see those squiggly lines, you see the birds, and you see death, and you see distress, psychic angst, right? You see something different depending on the context. And what his work showed is that how you contextualize a topic or a fact or a story makes a huge difference in how people see things, including old age. So this, for example, is a picture of an old woman who must be in her 80s from the Bend, right? She's on the street, she's by herself. And so we have notions in our head of what her life must be like. She's probably widowed, most women in their 80s are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now let me show you another picture of her. So it's Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And in the first picture, she's actually surrounded by her Secret Service agents. She's on the streets of New York, and it's a cold winter day, so that's probably why she's huddled. She may be bent over too because she's deciding how she's going to write her next brief on some big thing that, that impacts all of us. And yes, she is widowed. When we hear about aging, we also see a lot of things like this. So I Googled to find the one on the left. So the ultimate anti-aging guide. I mean, look at this woman. Like, what does she need anti-aging for goodness sake? Anyway, so she's worried at 22. I mean, I don't know. I can't tell how old she is. I'm old enough that I can't tell how old she is. But anyway, we work on these anti-aging things, and it's a huge, huge, huge industry, right? Anti-wrinkle cream. Do you know anybody who's over a certain age who doesn't have wrinkles? Like, it doesn't work, and we all pay for it anyway. So imagine if we spent all that money, right, on things that actually made a difference in human lives. There's also something called the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. Can you imagine the American Academy of Anti-Gay Medicine, the American Academy of Anti-Women Medicine, the American Academy of Anti-Brown Skin Medicine, right? Only aging is this allowed to happen in. We are against aging. And when you're against aging, what exactly are you against? Improving aging seems really different than against aging. And then age is just a number is something you hear often by a lot of people. So now I'm going to quote one of, where did it go? Okay, well, I know, it comes later, sorry. Okay, so this is, I thought I had put it next, but I moved it. So this is, Boston just launched a campaign, an anti-aging campaign, I guess you could call it, or an anti-ageism campaign. This is one of the posters they have all over the place, up on signs and on the web. Over the Hill, I'm a lot of things, and Over the Hill isn't one of them. So she's age 86. Well, you'll notice a few things. And this is one of my pet peeves with AARP. This is a woman who is gorgeous. Like, I didn't look that good at 20. So it, seriously, so it just isn't realistic to, when I'm 86, I'm not gonna look like that, if I live that long. And it's great, but what she is over the hill, technically. I mean, if the hill is adulthood, if the hill is the hill of anxiety we saw earlier, she's on the back side of it, and what we're saying is that's not okay, right? We're denying the obvious. That isn't pro-age. That is saying you can't be what you are or what you soon will be. And here's another one of their things, frail. He's saying I'm not frail. This is a guy in his 80s. If he lives much longer, he will become frail. And what we're saying is it's not okay. What they're saying is it's not okay to be frail, right? That we should care about him because he's not frail. So then what happens to him when he becomes frail? Then we have created a society where we can't even talk about what that means for him, and we're showing no compassion. So one of the things I want to really have you think about today is that a lot of times people mean really well, like a whole lot of smart people worked on this Boston campaign, and yet it is undermining their very intent, which is upsetting. So this is the slide I was thinking of before. This is Ursula K. Le Guin, the writer, who died earlier this year. So she has a couple really good rebuttals. This was from one of her last books, which talks about her own aging. One comment is, to tell me my old age doesn't exist is to tell me I don't exist, right? To say I'm not frail, I'm not over the hill. It's to not see people for who they are. Her other comment I love, if I'm 90 and believe I'm 45, I'm headed for a very bad time trying to get out of the bathtub, right? And that's why this thing of age is just a number is idiocy, right? Which as a woman in her 80s, she well realized. Okay, that little graph, you don't really need to see anything, but that is the rise in ageism over the last century plus, right? We've become more ageist. This matters because there's a woman at Yale called Becca Levy who's done tremendous research into age stereotypes, both positive and negative, and their impact on health. So she has found things, for example, that if you have negative attitudes about old age, you will get heart disease 7 years sooner. You are more likely to have Alzheimer's markers in your cerebrospinal fluid, and you are less likely to recover well after a hospitalization or surgery. Perhaps because you don't believe it's possible. But if you have positive aging stereotypes, you do better with almost everything. So believing, understanding that things can be better. You're not going to be 35 again, but you can absolutely regain strength. So among the things we have known for decades in medicine is that you can build muscle at any age. There was a great study in the mid-90s by a doctor called Maria Fiatarone, who showed that she took people at a skilled nursing facility in Boston between the ages of 70 and 99 and had them do muscle strength exercises. And literally people with walkers started using canes. People with canes didn't need them. People who hadn't done steps in a few years did steps. But our health system doesn't pay for people to exercise and get the right training. And because we don't train people in that information, even when I send my patients to physical therapy, I find they're not pushed. Right? They're not given weights to lift. They're not pushed hard enough because so many people don't believe, even though we have the data. So we need to think about how to work around that barrier that keeps people from seeing what is right in front of them and the sort of information they would use for any other sort of person. Which brings me to transforming medicine. So when I was a medical student in that very room, we learned about different sorts of human beings. We learned that human beings basically came in two kinds. There were children and adults. We did learn that there were variations. So for instance, sometimes the 70-kilogram man, who was the norm, would, get pregnant or something like that, in which case you knew she was a female. She would sometimes have sickle cell disease, and that's how you knew she was African American. And he would sometimes get AIDS, and that's how you would know he was gay. But other than that, he was a pretty straight-up 70-kilogram man, which is, as you may realize, a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of the human population. Or it was a baby. So we had about 4 or 5 months of training on childhood, and we had a couple hours on elderhood, and the whole rest of the time was on adulthood. So, surprise, surprise, who are the patients most likely to be harmed by medical care? Elders, because we were taught nothing about them. The NIH has had special mandates to include various sorts of people in their research for the last 20 to 30 years. Now, this was because, again, we were just studying 70-kilogram white heterosexual men. And that was because, and we first learned this with women, so they would say, well, women are different. They have these different hormones, and you can just tell they're different by looking at them. And so we're not going to put them in our studies because it's going to complicate things. So seriously, I mean, it does complicate things, and in science, you want to control as many variables as possible. So they would study the men, and then they would apply the results to the women, and guess what? The women had worse outcomes. So, for example, with heart disease, typical chest pain, you've got the crushing chest pain, maybe it goes down your arm, maybe it goes into your jaw. Everything else is atypical. Most women have atypical chest pain. Most older people have atypical chest pain. Most diabetics have atypical chest pain. So actually, atypical chest pain is typical, right? It's the most common type, but because of those studies, we still call it atypical. Same thing happened with blood pressure drugs in black people. It turned out, well, we said we're not going to study black people. They're different. We can't recruit them. I can't imagine why they wouldn't trust people, but anyway. And then we would apply the results, and there would be worse outcomes. Okay, so we started including children, people of color, and women in research decades ago. The NIH passed its first mandate for the inclusion of elders in medical research in 2019, just this year, right? Because everyone agrees. Like the buttons on the table about, aging is something we all have in common. Well, apparently ageism is something we all have in common too, but I'm hoping this group can move that forward. So. Oh, I must be going the wrong direction. What? Yes, it's because I turned this upside down. Okay, so adverse drug reactions go way up with older age. Not a surprise if you haven't studied people. And if we know metabolism changes and your end organs change. So I see this a lot with my patients. Well, they'll say, well, that drug can't be the problem because I've been taking it for years. Okay, the drug didn't change, but your liver and kidneys' ability to manage that drug changed, and your brain and your bones and your muscles' ability to deal with that drug did change because you got older, even as the drug stayed the same. We also put safety guards on over-the-counter drugs, right? Don't take if you're pregnant. Don't take if you're a certain age. But the people most likely to have adverse drug reactions from really common medicines, so anybody heard of Advil, ibuprofen, all those things? Not good in people over age 70. Any precautions? Nope. Cold medicines, if you're an older man and you like to be able to urinate when you want to, might not be a good idea, even though it's over the counter, right? So we don't have the same precautions for old people as we do for younger people. The other thing you'll see here, and I'll show you this again, is that we lump all older people together as if it's a singular entity. And the graph on the right shows you that it's age specific, that your risk goes up with increasing age. This is not surprising. When I studied pediatrics and still today, there were special manuals, and the manuals would show you what to do for infants, what to do for toddlers, kids. We didn't have tweens then, but essentially tweens, teens, etc. But we don't do that in old age. How does that impact medical care? Well, this is not the resident I'm going to tell the story about, but I worked with a resident a few years ago, and he was interested in writing, and so I write, so I get a lot of people who are interested in writing, and he submitted a story to me, and he says, oh, I really like this one. Can you read it? So I read it, and he was talking about a really busy call day, lots and lots of patients, and he gets his hand out, it's this little card from another resident's sign out, and it says, 4-year-old dying. And so he's only an adult doctor, so he figures, it's 84-year-old, 94-year-old, the usual, and they just left out the number. That turned out to be right. Anyway, so he looks at all his patients, and he says, another dying old lady, so I'm going to see everyone else first. So he sees everyone else first, and then, because he's assuming this. And then he gets there, and what he sees is this, a 34-year-old woman. And he feels terrible because he feels like he should have gone sooner. And he talks about it with his friends, and this is all in the story, and they all agree that sign-outs have to be more specific, because if he had known the patient was 34, he would have gone to see her sooner. So that was literally the message he thought he should get from this story. He did not see that the problem was he didn't care about someone who was dying at 84 or 94, that he thought that person wasn't worthy of his time or attention. Because yes, best case scenario in a human life is we die in old age. That doesn't mean that death doesn't matter to that person or the people who love him or her. So this is the CDC vaccine schedule for this year, 2019. You're not meant to see all this, but what I will show you is that across that line is 17 categories of kids with different schedules. So how they decide what vaccines you need depend on your age, it depends on your biology, it depends on your social behaviors. So 17 categories for kids, 5 categories for adults, which I've shown here on the left, 6 actually. Then you see you get to 65 plus. There is a single category for people 65 plus, even though my oldest patient was 111, which means we're talking a half century of human life with a single category. Do we really think there was no change in the biology of those people over the half century or in their social behaviors? Absolutely not. Moreover, we know that the immune system changes dramatically in old age. So this is another way in which not doing research on people, not seeing them, not counting them as fully human affects what care we give people and what we see and don't see. And I will admit that until I was working on my book, and this I'm talking like 2 or 3 years ago, I had been a geriatrician since the mid-90s. I didn't even notice there was a problem with this, right? It's in all our heads. One day I looked at it and I thought, my God, I have not seen this for like a quarter century. I looked at it all the time and I thought there was no problem over age 65. That's not okay. They're very, very different. As we see here, so hospitalization by old age subgroup, right? If you're in your 60s or early 70s, your chances of being hospitalized are relatively low. You get into your 70s and early 80s, it goes up, and it goes up from there. You have different risks. You are a different person, and we need to acknowledge that. We need a language for that. We have so many words for the substages of childhood. And actually, we don't have too many for adulthood either. It's sort of like young adult, early middle-aged, later middle-aged. You know, we just don't think about that. And in fact, in medical school, when we learned about human development, it basically stopped at age 16, and after that we learned about human sexuality, and that was it. That was the whole thing. So apparently, like, you develop until you're in your teens, and then you develop sexually, and other than that, you don't grow or change, which we know isn't true. Especially in a world where it used to be that when you got sick, you didn't really get old, you just sort of got sick and died, you know, in early parts of adulthood. But over the last century, our lives have increased by decades, and those decades mostly accrue to later adulthood and to elderhood. The problem is our medical care system is so focused on saving lives, on diseases as opposed to on wellness, that what we've created is a long time of relative disability rather than health. So let me give you an example. We have talked about how exercise makes a colossal difference in a person's ability to function. Their ability to function determines their ability to be, doing things in society and not be socially isolated. Social isolation leads to bad health. Not having a good functional ability leads to bad health. So all those things lead to premature disease and increased healthcare usage. But our health system will not pay for people to get the kind of exercise training and support they need, both psychological, because it's hard to make yourself do it every day, and literal. But what it will pay for is for you to get really frail and then to fall and have a fracture, and then it will send an ambulance to pick you up, and it will take you to the emergency department and do tests and x-rays, and then it will send you upstairs to the hospital, and it will pay for your whole surgery, for your stay in the hospital after that, and for your rehabilitation. And for that same cost, you could have kept a whole community of people in a particular neighborhood healthy. But that's what we value. We value the wrong things. Now, the anti-aging people are hoping our future will look like this, right? Where we live longer and there's less time where we have age-related disease. And that would be wonderful. But I also think when we're focused that way, we need to think about what it means for the planet, what it means for people in crowded places, because we know when human beings get crowded, they begin killing each other, right? And we know the planet's in trouble. So another thing that medicine doesn't do particularly well is think about the longer term effects. Like, yes, we can keep you from dying from your heart attack, and then what happens to you? Yes, we can cure your cancer, and then what happens to you? Yes, we can help people live longer, and then what happens to you? So these are questions we need to begin asking as a society. We also need to value older lives. So this is how much people get flu. If you look at the chart on the right, that's people over age 65 in that high graph. So people likely to be hospitalized or die from flu are, hands down older people. And yet, I'm going to read to you from a medical news source and from the San Francisco Chronicle. Hospitalizations due to the flu are also on the rise, with the highest rates among kids under age 4 and older adults. And yet, if you look at the bottom line, that's one of the bottom lines is kids under age 4, older adults, the top line, right? So way more older adults dying than kids under age 4. Last week, the CDC reported that 4 more children had died from the flu this season, bringing the number of pediatric deaths to 11. No mention of the old people who died in much, much, much greater numbers. Why is that? Well, the Chronicle talks about how though people age 65 are the most vulnerable to flu, reporting their deaths is problematic. It would require too much time and money, and their cases are often complicated by multiple health problems that make pinning the death on flu challenging. Well, if you have the flu, chances are that's why you died, even if you have multiple other health problems, right? The multiple other health problems make you more likely to die of your flu, so you could simply count it that way. But this also harkens back to women have all this estrogen in their blood, and that changes their risk of heart disease, so we're not going to count them. We can't keep doing this, and yet we keep doing it. Reminds me of Ralph Ellison. I am an invisible man. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Now, we refuse to see all kinds of people, but among those people are people who grow old of all types. And this happens in all sectors. So I have a story in the book about being called by a daughter one Sunday morning. Her mother had been looking forward to something on the Saturday and then had gotten up and just not. She'd been talking about it all week. Mother was, I think, late 70s, but fully functional. They lived together, actually, because the daughter had gotten divorced, not because the mother needed help. And she just didn't want to go, and the daughter couldn't understand. And then the daughter went to bed in the evening, and the mother was in the bathroom. And then she got up to go to the daughter got up to go to the bathroom. The mother was still in the bathroom about 4 hours later, so she called the paramedics. And the paramedics came and said, well, they examined her, and they said, well, she's old. And the daughter said, well, no, she seems confused. And they said, well, she's in her late 70s. Of course she's confused. And they left. And they made the daughter feel bad. They made her feel stupid, like she'd wasted EMS services. So she called me. And when a person changes how they're thinking or functioning, that is a medical emergency. So we sent her to the emergency room, and she had been bleeding into her head. Now, who knows how, if we could have stopped the bleeding earlier if the paramedics had actually paid attention. But you can't necessarily blame them because they're products of this ageist culture and because they, like most professionals, get no training in old age. So they didn't know, but they really harmed this person. Now, this is a Pulitzer-winning book from 1975 called Why Survive? This was the guy who founded the National Institutes on Aging, the first division of geriatrics. The tragedy of old age is not the fact that each of us must grow old and die, but that the process of doing so has been made unnecessarily and at times excruciatingly painful, humiliating, debilitating, and isolating. And the sad part is that I feel like his book is about as relevant now as it was in 75 when it won the Pulitzer, except maybe that isn't true in the last few years. Because if you notice, I used to see something on aging in the media every year. And then about 10 years ago, it became every month. And about 5 years ago, it became every week. And now there's more about it every day than I can keep up with. So I think we're at a shifting moment. And that brings us to the last short section of this talk, where I'm just going to try and inspire you all to reimagine today. think always, when people are mentioning childhood and adulthood, of elderhood as well. When they mention kids and adults, mention elders. So on your tables, you have something about the World Health Global Network for Age-Friendly Cities, and there are 8 domains. So I actually think of it in terms of 11 domains. I think 8 domains are fine, but they have lumped things, and I can see why, but in medicine we also talk about lumpers and splitters, and I'm a splitter. So I tend to think that outdoor spaces and buildings have different people who work on them. And so they're kind of different. And I think of civic participation and employment as different also, right? Because people in their 70s are the fastest growing segment of the American workforce. But at some point, most people do retire from at least paid employment if they can possibly afford to do so. And that doesn't mean they can't or shouldn't vote or volunteer in their community or do various other things. So to me, those are different. And so I call this out only just to get you thinking about who are the stakeholders you need to engage in these different areas. They might be different. And then this is a picture from, the internet is 50 years old this week, I think. Really early computers. When I was in college, there was one like this in the engineering building. So for the younger people, like that was who used computers then. And then we got these sort of desktop-y things. And you'll notice both are kind of ugly, and they kind of had not so many people who used them. It was sort of, nerdy engineering types. And then this guy came along and he said, well, just because it's functional doesn't need to be ugly. Right? And we do that with old age, right? We say, I don't know if my mother is 86 now, and when I take her shopping, it's hard to find anything terribly attractive for her to wear. And we make equipment for old people and we make it ugly. And then we say, well, old people don't care about their appearance. Well, what happens if they literally can't find anything that looks nice, right? So he said, just because something's functional doesn't mean it has to be ugly. And can't this be of use to even more people, right? If it works, couldn't it work for more things? So let's think about our parks. Our parks are made for kids. They're these cute, colorful, fun things for kids to play on. And then we have basketball courts and baseball fields and things like that for adults. Just recently, in recent years, people are starting to think, well, what do we have for elders? So mostly I find in suburban, largely white communities, they're starting to have pickleball courts, which are like a really small tennis court. It's almost like a table tennis, but on a court. It's like a mix of table tennis, and the balls are these soft things, so you're not going to hurt anyone. You move around, but you don't have to run as far. It's social. Usually it's played in groups of 4, so lots of advantages. But you can do other sorts of things. I mean, here are some women doing Tai Chi in the park, but notice they've just put down their little towels on the cement because there isn't really a place for them. Contrast that with this, where they've put up these poles, and a group of older people are learning how to build their muscles, just using really simple things that wouldn't cost a park service much to put in, and in a pretty place. So every part of society we need to think about, and what are we doing for elders? Nobody wants to live there, right? So we say, oh, you get old and you don't care, or we're going to warehouse you. Rarely good things come of warehousing. Now, some people like to be with only people like themselves, and there are some lovely places, but they're not available to everyone. So we should think more about having elder-friendly communities, like the World Health Organization says. And what can we do? So this is a movie theater, which is not going to be amenable to all kinds of people, and people with disabilities, not just people who are quite old and have some other challenges. We could just make movie theaters accessible to everyone. That's a door handle. This is a door handle that requires a certain amount of dexterity, and as you get arthritis, that becomes harder and harder, and that happens to most people by their 50s and 60s, right? So door handles should always look like that, because then you can just use the hand, or you can use the arm, or you can use your foot, or you can do all kinds of things. This is a bathroom. You can't see very well, but it's got a tub. with a really tall lip. And we heard Ursula Le Guin talk about tubs and getting in and out. And instead, we could have a place that's actually very attractive. This is obviously a high-end bathroom, but anyway, you could wheel a wheelchair in. You've got rails, and it still looks really nice. Anybody know what these things are? Those are hearing aids for men, right? Meant to look like jewelry. Hearing aids don't need to be ugly. And this is the fashion icon, right? So you can look cool at any age. How you look might be different. It's going to depend on who you are, but we shouldn't say you don't need to be fashionable. We need to encourage people to actually talk to old people as human beings. This was in the Times a few years ago, where this woman who was entirely compos mentis, she was a bit shorter because people do shrink. I can now see clear over my mother's head. That was not formerly the case. So they're smaller. They might have a little more trouble hearing, but it doesn't mean people can't actually talk and speak for themselves. And then this is on the left was Oliver Sacks, so one of the great doctor writers of the 20th century and early 21st century. And this was his partner, Bill Hayes, who wrote a beautiful book about this that I quote in my book. And what struck me was it wasn't about this at all. It was sort of a love letter to New York and to Bill's two partners. But when he talks about his life with Oliver, who was 30 years older than he doesn't make a big deal of that Oliver needed help with certain things. It's just part of their relationship. Because if you think about it, we all need help with certain things. Like if my computer has a problem, I'm not the one who fixes that in my house, but if the cooking is going wrong, I can help with that. And maybe those are traditional roles, whatever, we help each other, and that's fine. So his book offers a way of looking at it just as it's a normal part of life that happens to all of us, and I like that attitude. The other thing to say is when people say we can't afford any of this, the earlier you intervene to do things, the less expensive, right? We let people get frail, we let them age in communities that aren't set up for old people, and then we spend a lot of money. When we think proactively about including people, we spend less money. And then finally, this is a typical age pyramid. You will notice that second to the right there are people who I would say are about my age, mid-50s, moving in towards 60. And then suddenly you've got people in a wheelchair. Well, my mother's 30 years older, and she's not in a wheelchair yet. She is slower. But I think we don't really show the full picture of a human life, which might look more like this. And we have to remember that old lasts a long time and has generations and different sorts of people. So what if the greatest limitations come from our imaginations and policies, not our physiology of aging? And I will leave you with that and just my graph of a human lifespan, which shows you that childhood is quite small, adulthood is quite big, and elderhood can also be quite large. So thanks for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions.
So we're taking questions from the audience now, and you have cards. Raise your hands if you have cards, and bring them to me, and I'll read them to Louise. And actually, I have a question, Louise.
Okay.
So there are a lot of people in this room. Some of them are practitioners, service providers, and I think probably all of them are patients. And so maybe this is a question for all of us who are patients. Mm-hmm. Do you have some tips for how to interact with a physician who is not seeing a person, whether it's you yourself or a loved one?
That's really interesting. So how do you deal with somebody who isn't seeing you or somebody else? I mean, I think if you're with someone and they're not speaking to that person, you can say, excuse me, you want to be polite, or people might take it out on you later, I guess. Human beings, providers are human beings. So just say, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but actually, he or she is the patient, and I really feel like you should be having this conversation with him or her. I'm happy to be here to help, but I'd like to be in the background. You can also arrange the chairs, and actually the clinician should do this, him or herself, where they are face to face with the actual patient, not with the caregiver or adult child. That should be set up in the physical space that way, so the right person is in the right place. So you can stack the deck, right? Because usually you get roomed and then you wait a bit, so you can arrange yourselves appropriately. And I think you don't want to be behind the person so that they're looking up at you over that person's head. You want to be alongside so that if there is a conversation, it's all three of you. It's not you speaking literally over that person. And then if they're not seeing you exactly, if you're the one there, then I would say, hey, I'm feeling like you're not actually hearing me. So one of my favorite jokes is actually a true story about a 96 or 7-year-old man who had a painful knee and went into a doctor. And the doctor took the history and then moved the knee around and said to the man, well, what do you expect? The knee is 96 or 97. And without missing a beat, true story, the guy said, well, my other knee is 96 also, and it doesn't hurt a bit. Right? So you could tell them that joke and say, I understand that old age increases my risk for having health problems, but I actually think that we need to diagnose what's going on here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay. So another question, any reasons to be optimistic that more people will study geriatric medicine?
Well, I'm working hard on that, as you can see. I think so. I think because aging is everywhere, people see it more than they used to. They used to literally, and I talk about it in the book, how I, who am now a geriatrician, didn't even see it. I didn't notice. And you saw with the CDC thing, I didn't notice that till 2 years ago. So I think it just wasn't on the radar and you got no exposure in medical school. So now we have more. UCSF, they now get 2 weeks. Woohoo! Anyway, so we're making progress, but I also think in their world and lives, they're seeing more of it. I'm trying to make a case with my colleagues. I think we have been self-defeating, and I don't just mean for geriatric physicians, but I think across fields of gerontology and geriatric clinical specialties. We have said there are too few of us, and so we're going to focus on the oldest and frailest. And that has made it like being, just a neonatologist instead of a pediatrician. So I think we need to focus on all of old age, and we need to spend a lot more time on thinking how do we improve people's health and function earlier in old age and have different sorts of specialists. Some of the most exciting science is in aging. So I'm trying to pull people in on science, on technology, on healthy aging, on frail aging, on sites of care. So I'm hopeful. When I speak to older audiences, they're like, what do I do about getting a geriatrician? I'm like, well, it does take us 10 years to make one, so that's a problem. But I think the more we start talking about this and acknowledging the inequities, we have a lot of people at UCSF who want to go into underserved care, and they don't realize that this is a huge area.
Thank you. Another question, what research is being done regarding the intersection between LGBTQ and aging?
So lots of good research in that. There's a guy actually at UCSF, although he's leaving to go to Las Vegas in January, called Jason Flatt, who's done some really interesting work in San Francisco, but there are more and more people. It's not everywhere. It's sort of where you would expect, San Francisco, New York, Boston, but really thinking about intersectionality, right? So imagine if you're female and you're black and you're LGBTQ and now you're old. There are all these things impact, or even if you're the white 70-kilogram man, LGBTQ and old, things change. So people are really looking at what difference does it make. Now, some of it is if you're part of any socially looked down upon population, the stress of just being you is harder. You're also less likely to have earned good money. Which means you have less money for retirement. You're more likely to have lived in poverty, which also adds to your decreased opportunities and less good health. So really looking at all of this. And for current LGBTQ, much older people, they've also dealt with discrimination and are afraid of disclosing, and there are fewer places for them to go live safely, but more communities starting things. Like we have something called Open House SF in San Francisco that's a really good community hub with some housing. So I think people are working on that, but these are two sort of newish areas, aging and LGBTQ studies, but definitely things are looking up in terms of the amount of interest and the numbers of grants.
And we have time, I think, for one more question. This one is, what do you think of Ezekiel Emanuel, who wants to die at 75?
So I actually have a huge rant in my book about this. So on the one hand, it's not unreasonable to say, at a certain point, I'm not going to do preventive stuff, because the benefit from prevention, the shorter your time horizon, the benefit from prevention goes down, and the harms are immediate from preventive services, and the benefits have decreased. So that's not unreasonable. But I have several problems with the way he articulates this. One is that one person's 75 isn't somebody else's 75. We like to say in geriatrics, if you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old. So it really depends much more on your health and functional status, and of course also on your personal values and goals, which the medical system tends to discount, but which are critically important to what matters for a given individual. So what is 75? You know, are you 75, you're running marathons, you just started a company? Are you 75 in a wheelchair on oxygen? These make big differences. The thing that really got me about his comments, which were made in The Atlantic and a variety of other places, were that he said, well, okay, yeah, so say I'm just like reading and I'm seeing the grandchildren a few times a week and, you know, I'm making nice food and I'm hanging around my community, like, you know, that's not a life worth living. Why are we preserving people for that sort of life? I mean, he basically like discounted, I'm not getting it quite right, he basically discounted most female lives through human history and many, many others. And so it was coming from this place of an uber successful white male saying, if I'm not going to be at the very top of the human heap, I just assume be dead. And that is my biggest problem with what he said.
We have like 2 more minutes.
Okay.
And there's a question that is, how can we impact MD training and curriculum? And I know you don't have a lot of time, but I think you probably have a nice succinct answer for that.
Yeah, I think just keep, everywhere you go to your health system or your physicians, just keep saying, what do you mean you have specialists for children and adults, but you don't have a specialist for me if you're older? Or what do you mean you have someone for my child, but you don't have someone for my mother or father? Keep putting the pressure on the health systems because they are thinking we don't need this. And if you call a clinic that does take care of older adults and they say, well, we're not even keeping a wait list, say, I want a wait list. Or call that system and say, what do you mean you're not keeping a wait list? The demand is so great that you can't bother to keep a wait list. What are you doing about this? And you just keep pressuring because I think we're going to have to change over the health system and the priorities. Speak to people about, if you love your work and love working with older people, talk about that. Talk about the opportunities, right? This isn't a tsunami so much as this is a time for us to re-envision human life with extra decades. There is so much opportunity for creativity and innovation in this area. We need it, and we are the generation that gets to do it, and that is hugely exciting. So just talk about that wherever you go.
Thank you, Louise.
Sure.